So ladies, I have yet another message for you here. I want to call this one, There's More Than Meets the Eye. The other night, I was co-leading a Bible study with the pastor of the church that I go to, and it was on Ezekiel chapter 28, and in particular, verses 11 through 19. So if you have a Bible or an app on your phones, just look that up. Ezekiel 28, verses 11 through 19. The passage is, I think, a multi-layered one, as most of the passages are in the Bible, because God's the author. Whereas we may speak on one subject, God speaks on multiple subjects because He's the great I am, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And so when you read this passage, I think it's more of an allegorical type of passage where it uses things on the surface to really point to what's going on underneath. And in this passage, the king of Tyre is being prophesied against by Ezekiel. And it's very apparent that the king is corrupt, that his officials are corrupt, that they've been given much, but underneath it all, they don't really acknowledge the God of the universe who made it possible for them to have all of these things. But when you start reading the passage, which on the surface is talking about this earthly king and his officials, it talks about cherubim, it talks about the Garden of Eden, it talks about the consuming fire, and when you read elsewhere in God's Word, these are terms that have to do with Satan. And so really, again, with this particular passage, quote unquote, there's more than meets the eye. In other words, God's talking about this earthly king, but is using it more or less to illustrate what's behind this earthly king, that Satan is behind this earthly king. And that just brings to mind many of the difficulties that we are forced to suffer through as believers, whether they be people who are hard-hearted, even fellow believers that are hard-hearted to the truth, people that just don't seem to come around. I think this passage and others like it are pointing to the fact that there may be something that's not entirely human about those people that are hard-hearted. In other words, Satan and his demonic entities are blinding them to the ways of Christ, to the ways of brokenness, to the ways of being able to see the truth. And so my advice to you is understand that many times, maybe the majority of the times, when we encounter hard-hearted people, and I'm talking about people, really, what we're really encountering are the spiritual forces of darkness behind them that are blinding them to the truth. I think Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 in particular, and you need to read that, but I've quoted it, dozens of times in my other devotions, I think. Paul is very blunt that our true battle, true war that we're facing as believers is not against flesh and blood. So as believers, we need to be ever more vigilant against the reality of Satan and his influence. If you want to change people, pray against the forces that are behind them in the spiritual realms. God bless you.